past. They were there a lot. Don't short them out. So the first Europeans, John Coulter, probably. We don't know, but probably, it's a good guess, 1807 and 1808. Made a trek through the park with the Crow Indians. He wouldn't have been by himself. It would have been pretty suicidal in the middle of winter. He was part of the Lewis and Clark expedition. He had been to the Pacific Ocean and back, and came back through this area with, he was here with Clark, and they went down the Yellowstone. Somewhere down there in South Dakota somewhere, they ran into fur trappers, or were already coming up the Missouri River, American fur trappers. So he convinces Captains Lewis and Clark to let him go, to release him from the Corps. And they agreed to that as long as nobody else in the Corps asked to be let go. And no one else wanted to. Everybody, they were all wanted to get back to civilization. But John Coulter was a young man, and he loved the wilderness. So he turns around and comes back up. 1806, spends 1806 and 1807 probably up in the Sunlight Basin, they think, somewhere in that area up in there. Southeast of Cook City, somewhere in there. Of course, the Cody is the big winter crow camp. That was a huge encampment in the wintertime for the Crow Indians, was Cody. And the reason they were there is because they were down out of the mountains, but they were close enough to hunt, and there were hot springs there. There's hot springs in the river along there, which is why it was called the Stinking Water originally, was that river was called. So in 1807 and 1808, the winter of 1807-08, he makes this trek through the Yellowstone Park, probably with Crow Indians, probably a bunch of young guys. They went out, and they leave Cody. They go down south. They cross over what is now Union Pass, drop down into the Tetons, into the Jackson Hole Valley. He actually crosses over Teton Pass and into the backside Pierre on the Idaho side, comes back over. Then they go north up, hit the Snake River, make their way up to Yellowstone Lake, come along the west side of the lake, follow the Yellowstone River up. Then they jump over, they follow up the Lamar, and then Lamar up and out of the park and drop down onto Clark's Fork and back up to Cody. Now we know that because when John Coulter came out of the wilderness in 1809, everybody coming back from the wilderness, when you got to St. Louis, it was almost a law, not quite, but everybody did it, that you met with William Clark. William Clark was the Indian agent for the Missouri Territory because he wanted all the information you had. So on Clark's 1814 map, if you look at his 1814 map, you'll see a dotted line through, and you see what they called the three paps, which were the Tetons, and you see Lake Eustis, which is Yellowstone Lake, which is a big blob. But you see this dotted line, and it says Coulter's route, 1807. So John Coulter sat down with Clark and went over the maps and talked about where he had been. So he is given credit with being the first European. We don't know, there might have been other people in there before him. We know that, and then of course, the War of 1812 upsets all the fur trade, stops kind of out here. By 1818, we know that the Northwest Company, which was in, well, they were fighting against the Hudson Bay Company. They were a Canadian fur trapper company. They're in the Yellowstone area. McKenzie and his people are in there. They come in south, they come off of Spokane House and the Columbia River, down through the Snake River Plains. Actually, they probably came over, dropped down through Wisdom, Montana, and Jackson, Montana, which has hot springs, because they talk about those. They went down to Henry's Lake. They went around the south end of the park, and then up into Yellowstone, probably up the Snake River. And those guys were fur trapping, so they're going out there, they're trapping every little tributary they could find. They're all over. So we know by 1818, the Northwest Company is all over. 1822, the Americans get into it. We know by 1826 that they're in the area because we get reports from Jedediah Smith, and those guys were up in here. In 1827, the first published account of Yellowstone, what was to become Yellowstone National Park, is published in a newspaper in Philadelphia. And a gentleman by the name of Daniel Potts, who was with Jedediah Smith, they were trapping and they came up the Snake River. They were on the west side of the lake, just beyond West Thumb Geyser Basin. You go on around the lake and head toward Lake Hotel. There's an area there called Potts Hot Springs. Right when you go around the corner there. And they camped there, and he wrote a letter home to his brother describing the area, describing the lake. And it got sent out, and it got to his brother. That was probably 1826. Anyway, in 1827, the newspaper publishes that paper. And that's the first written description published of what was to become Yellowstone National Park in the hot springs, 1827. And in the 1960s, the Potts family, two sisters who were the last of the family, were going through the family house and they found the letter. And the letter is in the archives at Millionth Hot Springs. Up there, they turned it over to the National Park Service. So it's a really important document. 1829, Joe Meek is traveling through this area. He's down at Devil's Slide down here and runs in with the Crow Indians, and he escapes and manages to get away with a horse and some of his equipment, and he goes down through the park and probably goes through, later on he describes the Hot Springs area, which we think is probably the Norris Geyser Basin, is where he did, so 1829. By 1839, they're all over this area. They're in the Paradise Valley. Bridger and Jim Bridger and Osborne Russell are trapping the Paradise Valley and going up. It's where we start getting references to the Big Bend of the Yellowstone. And then what they call 25-Yard Creek, which is actually the Shields River. And they would go up the Shields River and drop over and down to Great Falls onto the Missouri. So that route was really well, of course, those were all Native American trails. So those fur trappers were all over here. And Jim Bridger and part of his group, actually, I think in 1837, wintered over here at the Great Bend of the Yellowstone River. We don't know exactly where. It's in one of the guys talked about it. But about a third of the way into the winter, they decide enough of the wind and they go down into the valley and spend the rest of the winter down somewhere in Paradise Valley. So they were using this area a lot. So they were in and out of the park at this time. You know, they were all over. In 1845, the fur trade declines, and so then you see kind of a hiatus. Although there were people going in there in the 1850s, Father Cuppins, who was a Jesuit priest out of the Fort Benton area, made a trip with the Blackfeet Indians into the park. We think about 1857, went through Yellowstone National Park.
Paul,
Yes.
when you mentioned the fur trade, does that include buffalo hides or
No,
not?
buffalo hides kind of come later. The fur trade
So
is
that was,
beaver.
they weren't interested in them at that point?
Not at that
More
point.
beaver.
Okay.
It was all beaver and marten and things like that. The buffalo hide trade comes when the Americans, after the Civil War, decide they want to get rid of the Native Americans. And one way to do that is to get rid of all the
Cut
buffalo.
off their supplies.
So that's when you see the big slaughter of the bison in the 1880s. For leather, a lot of that leather. They say the British Army marched on American bison all over the world. Boots and so forth. Was that. So that, yeah, the fur trade is really not the bison trade. That's something, the
Okay.
bison come later. So by the 1860s, you start getting all these different explorers in the park. And most of these guys now, what they are is they're prospectors. They're looking for gold, which is really common in those days. And there's a whole bunch of them. In 1863, Walter DeLacy Creek is named after him in the park. And people you've never heard of, Phelps Davis, Lou Anderson, are coming through. And these are prospectors. Colonel DeLacy, in his diary, calls it his 40 thieves. He and his 40 thieves chose to go through the park that year. They came in through the south end and were into the south end. Phelps Davis, I wanted to go, I made some notes here. And these are some notes I made a long time ago. Lou Anderson prospecting party in 1866. They gave the names to Hell Roaring Creek and Slough Creek. And the story is one of their guides was out in front and he came back and he says, there's a big creek up here and it's a hell roarer. So that's how hell roaring got its name. Then the next day he came back, he was up ahead and they said, oh, there's another big creek up here a ways, but it's a slough, 'tis a slough. So they called it Slough Creek. And that's where we got Slough Creek, but they lost 2 horses crossing Slough Creek, got washed away and drowned. So it was a little bit later. So some of these names start showing up that we still use today. Henderson, another prospecting party that came through the park. And it's really funny, really quickly, as noted in his diary, when they started out from Deer Lodge in 1867, there were 2 sheets to the wind and the third fluttering with 2 bottles of whiskey in their connections. So, and of course they went through, and all these guys pretty much, some of them went south down through Henry's Lake and came around up through the Snake River. A lot of them by the mid-1860s were coming over and doing their final outfitting at Fort Ellis and then going over Trail Creek and going through. And almost all of them went out the west entrance, went out the Madison River. a real major use of that area there got started. That's a really easy way to get off the Yellowstone Plateau, off the Madison. And then in 1869, we have the Cook, Folsom, and Peterson group, and these were, well, they're not the first tourists, we know that, but they're really close to the first tourist in the park. 3 guys, miners from the Helena area, decided to go down and see what was happening. All these stories were circulating. The fur trappers had talked about what they'd seen, the prospectors had talked about seeing things. So these 3 guys, for no other reason than just to see what was going on, take a trip through the park that summer, actually that fall, Cook, Folsom, and Peterson. And they, Peterson writes up a really good account later that's published several years later, one of the early really good trips through the park of Cook, Folsom, and Peterson. So of course, when they got back out, now here's 3 guys that are pretty well known, at least locally. So our next expedition, 1870, is the Washburn, Langford, and Doane expedition. And Henry Washburn is the Surveyor General for the state of Montana. So he's a cartographer, a surveyor. Langford is a promoter for the Northern Pacific Railroad. He's out scouting out lands ahead of the railroad. He's also big time in the Masonic program. He holds the first Masonic ceremony in Montana is held by him. They have his papers at the Masonic Lodge in Helena. And then Gustavus Doane was in the military. He was at Fort Ellis, and he was charged with providing a military escort because Washburn was really well known, both of these guys. So that was a military expedition. They had a military group that went with them through the park.
Was Langford in the Masonic, was he at Bannock?
Yes, he was. He was he was probably part of the vigilantes.
Very good.
Yeah. In fact, I think,
Where
I might be wrong, I shouldn't say that.
Bannock.
At Bannock.
Yeah.
Okay. He may have served as a defense lawyer to begin with for one of them. He was pretty well known. I might be wrong on that. You'd have to look at Dimsdale's book. But yeah, he was at Bannock, Virginia City. He was all part of that. That's a whole other side story. If you're not familiar with the Montana Vigilantes, that's a whole other story. They know a few of them. They don't know. Actually, I think they know who a lot of them were. They're just not saying. Because what they think the prevailing feeling is they were organized so quickly, and they were so well organized, and they were so well funded, and their laws that they drew up were so concise. They think it was the Masons, because they were the ones that already had the organization to be able to do that.
Exactly.
And they were really strong in Montana at that time. So there's a really strong feeling it was the Masons who pulled that off. But that's a whole other story. But Nathaniel Langford, he was a well-known Mason. So of course Nathaniel Langford, also being on a working for the railroad, he goes back east and he delivers lectures back east about what he'd seen in Yellowstone Park, because he wants people to start coming out, because they want to sell property once they get out here, right? So he starts talking about the wonders of Yellowstone. Well, he delivers a talk just like I'm doing this evening in Washington, D.C., and it is attended by Vanderveer Hayden, the Hayden surveys. Now, Hayden had been out here with Captain Reynolds in 1859 and 1860, and they had come out. Reynolds was supposed to be in northern Montana to view an eclipse of the sun, which was they needed at the time for scientific research. And they came out up the Platte River, and they split off, and this is all I can talk about this. They split. Lieutenant Maynadier dropped down the Bighorn River and came up the Yellowstone, crossed about where Springdale is, went up behind Sheep Mountain, up over Brackett Creek, and then he met Reynolds at Three Forks. Reynolds came around the south end of the park. Now, with him was Ferdinand Vanderveer Hayden and Jim Bridger as a guide, and William Fitzpatrick, another really well-known fur trapper. They tried to get into the south end of the park. It's too early in the year. They can't do it. So they come around, they get over to Henry's Lake, they go up on Targhee Pass, and they look out over the basin there where West Yellowstone is today, and they look at the kind of out over the park area there. That's as close as Reynolds gets, and that's as close as Hayden gets. So here, 10 years later now, after the Civil War and so forth, he hears this speech by Doane, and so he's now one of the leading geologists for the government. And he's getting ready to take his group out into the west. He was gonna go to the Rocky Mountains. He decides, nope, we're gonna go to Yellowstone. And so in 1871, the Hayden Survey is the first official scientific survey. We call that official scientific because he brought scientists with him. He brought geologists, botanists, zoologists, cartographers, photographers, painters, William Henry Jackson, the photographer, Thomas Moran, the painter, so that they could document what they were seeing. And they did the first really scientific exploration of the park area in 1871. And then, of course, Hayden goes back to Washington, D.C., gets together with Nathaniel Langford and other people, and they push, and then there's a whole story on the myth of the creation of Yellowstone. But Yellowstone gets created on March 1st, 1872.
Who determined the boundaries? Hayden?
At that time, there wasn't really any boundaries. It was just referred to as the area, an area encompassing the headwaters of the Yellowstone. So they just kind of drew a big square on the map. Originally, that was the park. And who did the official boundary surveys, I'm not quite sure. Hayden came back in '78, but by that time, the government guys were in here already surveying, so they were laying things out and looking. Then the boundaries, because when they do the big boundary change, you know, the east boundary, why it's so strange is it follows the watershed of the Absarokas, right? Water going off the east side is outside the park, the water going to the
Were
west.
Idaho, Montana, and Wyoming established as states at that
No.
point? Montana wasn't, it
Not
was
till
a territory.
1889, they were
Okay,
all 1889,
Okay.
1890, yeah.
so they had no idea it would
No.
actually end up in 3 different
No.
states, okay,
None of the states were here at that point.
okay.
And then Wyoming had some pool, that's how come they got a Wyoming sales tax in there in the 1920s.
What was
That they
that?
take out of the park, they got you pay a Wyoming sales tax in the park. None of that goes to the park, it all goes to Wyoming. They don't put anything, they get nothing back to the park, it's really content. Actually, they pay for part of the school at Gardner, but that's about it. Whole nother story, right, the cultural history of Yellowstone, just all these little side things going off.
Why did Wyoming get the tax?
Because they had some pool in Congress and they got it passed. They said, listen, you know, this would have been Wyoming, so we lost all this tax base, so let us charge a sales tax in there, so that's what they did. That's why you pay Wyoming sales tax. In the park.
Gardner has the sales tax.
Yeah, that's a resort tax. It's a whole other story.
You're full of them.
So 1872, the civilians, Nathaniel Langford, NP Langford, they called him National Park Langford. He was the first superintendent of Yellowstone. Talked his way into it, didn't really know what he was doing. He was pretty fun. He laid out some of the earliest roads through the park from Mammoth down to the Old Faithful area, this beginning of the roads that we're familiar with today. Didn't have a really good, didn't get along really well, mainly because he didn't get much money. The government figured, that's out there in the middle of nowhere, what do we need to give money to it for, right? There's nothing going on. Well, by 1886, 14 years later, things were really bad in the park. There was some really bad administration in the park. The railroad had made a move to actually go right through the park. I'm going to talk a little bit about that here in a